while people are joining us. And then we'll join together for the lighting of the Hanukkah candles tonight. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Before we begin our program tonight, we'll take a few minutes to light Hanukkah candles together. Here we are on the 7th night already. It's going fast. I'm going to light the shamas. Bring some light and brightness into our lives. I love it when just as I was saying that, it went out. Sometimes we need to make the extra effort to bring the light in, right? So here we go. I love these last couple of nights of Hanukkah when we have all or almost all of the candles lit. It's just so beautiful. Add some light and warmth in this time of the year. Please sing with me from wherever you are. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim lavoteinu bayamim hahem b'hazman hazeh. We thank God for the miracles that happened for our ancestors and for the miracles that we have in this very day. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our virtual 2020 Schwartz-Goldstein Lecture, Jewish Mysticism and the Miracle of Hanukkah, with Rabbi Jeremy Rosen. Rabbi Rosen will be delving into Jewish mysticism and examining the miracle of Hanukkah through its lens. Rabbi Jeremy Rosen is a graduate of Cambridge University and Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem with a doctorate in philosophy. Apart from serving as a rabbi in the UK, he has been headmaster of Carmel College, professor at the Faculty for Comparative Religion in Wilrijk, Belgium, and director of Yakar Educational Foundation and Community Center in London. He is currently the rabbi of the Persian Jewish community of Manhattan and lectures frequently at the JCC Manhattan. We are deeply grateful to Joe and Marilyn Schwartz for their generosity in establishing and endowing this lecture for the purpose of adding to the religious and spiritual life of the congregation in loving memories of their fathers, Jack Schwartz and Samuel K. Goldstein. Zichronam Libracha. Their memories are for blessing always. We thank Joe and Marilyn for this amazing opportunity to study with Rabbi Rosen. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rabbi Rosen.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Sam. That's very sweet of you. I want to say what an honor it is to be giving this presentation this evening, because in my years in the rabbinate, on different continents, in different communities, I haven't come across a couple I admire as much as Joe and Marilyn for the magnificent way in which they combine their world cultural interests with their Jewish commitment. They support so many different Jewish institutions and Jewish people. Their charity, so much of which is done in secret, is amazing. And they are the almost epitome of what I consider to be the essential Jew. And I'm proud to know them, proud to be their friends, and honored that they've given me this opportunity. As you know, Hanukkah is a very controversial festival. First of all, if you think about it, I don't know any other word in Hebrew that is transliterated in so many variations that nobody knows if Hanukkah is CH or H, A-N-N, K-K, A-A-H, all the variations. But apart from the name of all our holy days, it is also the most controversial. And it's the most controversial for several reasons. The first one is that we regard it historically as the great victory of Judah Maccabee in 1063 against the Syrian Greeks, led by King Antiochus IV, who decided that despite the tolerance of Alexander the Great, despite the tolerance of the Persian empires, who had allowed any religion to do whatever it wanted so long as they accepted the political authority, this Antiochus, probably because he was held as a captive and as a hostage in Rome, had a big chip on his shoulder and decided that it was time to get the Jews to all convert to a Greek way of life. Now, the fact of the matter is that the Jews in the land of Israel, who had been conquered by Alexander, were already deeply committed to Greek ideas and a Greek way of life. They were ruled over autonomously by the high priests, and the high priests had brought the circus and the theater and the games to Jerusalem. And most Jews of the middle and upper classes were so attracted, they began to assimilate. But you know what Jews are like? When things are easy, they let things lapse. The moment somebody tells a Jew, you can't do this, dafka, they're going to do it. And Antiochus, for various reasons, decided it was time to force the Jews to give up their religion. And of course, there was a rebellion. The rebellion, we know from the book of Maccabees, was initiated by this man Matityahu, and he had 5 sons. The most aggressive of his sons, Judah Maccabee, led the revolt. And here we're dealing, if you like, with a small little country, highly divided, against the massive Syrian Empire. Because after the defeat of Alexander, his great empire was split between his generals. There was Seleucus, the general in the north, based on Damascus. There was Ptolemy, the general in the south, who was in charge of Egypt. And poor Israel, cut in the middle, sometimes was beaten up by the Syrians, sometimes beaten up by the Egyptians, and usually they had to negotiate their peace. And as often happened, they got their politics wrong, more often than right. And unfortunately, the priesthood itself was a disaster, and different houses of the priests rivaled each other. They bought the high priestship, they killed to get the high priestship. It was a terribly mixed up, messy state of affairs. And Judah Maccabee, leading this rebellion, had to face a Syrian center and military center in Jerusalem. The temple had been desecrated, and various small groups of soldiers occupied the country. So initially, when he led the revolt, there was no big deal to get rid of small little groups. And the Syrians kept on sending third-rate generals down to defeat him, and he defeated every one of them, and eventually was able to recover the temple. But it's not as though he defeated the Greeks. The main Greeks army never came, and on one occasion when they did come down, they had to go back because there was politics back in Syria. And so Judah Maccabee managed to get hold of the temple, but while he had hold of the temple, he didn't have control over Jerusalem. They're still in the Acra, the citadel. There was a Syrian garrison. But the Syrians had other problems. For a while, they let things be. When he was able to rededicate the temple, he did not in any way perform any miracles. The miracle of the candlelights is much, much later. When he rededicated the temple, he imitated King Solomon's dedication of the first temple, which took place over 8 days, and he decided to rededicate the temple in the same way. He rededicated it. And in the process of opening it, of course, he had to light the light that was always going in the temple, the eternal light. And he did that. And that was why initially it was called the Festival of Light, because he lit up the temple. Eventually, the Syrians took things seriously. They sent down a general by the name of Bacchides, who defeated poor old Judah, killed him, and took back control of the country, but had decided at this stage, we're not going to interfere with the temple anymore. After Judah, his brother Jonathan took over and managed to maintain a truce with Syria. But it wasn't until his brother, Simon, 20 years later, became the high priest that for the first time, one of the Maccabees was recognized as the leader of the country, and Simon became the first king. The Hasmonean dynasty, unfortunately, descended in stages to one of corruption and dishonesty, and brothers fighting brothers, brothers even killing brothers. There was only one moment when there was peace and harmony during that Hasmonean dynasty, and that was, interestingly, during the reign of Queen Shlomtzion, Salome, the woman queen. She was the only one who managed to get all these aggressive, fighting, argumentative people together, and for a while it was fine, but soon she was out of the way, brothers killing each other again, ended up with dear old Herod, who was not loved by anybody at all, and the eventual catastrophe. So the military side of Hanukkah was really not as great a victory as most people like to suggest it was. And the story of Hanukkah is mentioned in the book of the Maccabees, written originally in Hebrew, but preserved in the Apocrypha, in Greek and Latin translation. And then later on in the books of Josephus. Again, none of these sources mention anything about the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days. That doesn't appear until the Talmudic period, some 500 years later. And there you have this nice story that there was only oil able to last for 1 day, and it managed to last for 8 days, and that's why we have 8 days of Hanukkah to celebrate, and why we have a different candelabrum of 8 lights instead of the one in the temple of 7 lights. Of course, the inconsistency here is if the miracle, if the oil of the first day lasted normally, then the miracle was only for 7 days, not for 8 days. But we won't go into those minor details. But you see already that the Talmud does not mention Judah Maccabee. Mentions the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, as a general rule, but it's clear that by that time, they were so fed up of the idea that Jews could fight off this great, then it was Syrian, and then it was, in fact, Roman, that militarism was going to achieve something, that they decided they had to downplay the militarism of Hanukkah. And that's when they came up with this idea of the lights. And why they took from the prophet Zacharias, who lived long before the Maccabeans, this famous phrase, neither by might, neither by force, but by the Spirit of God our victory is won, which is the Haftarah we say on Shabbat Hanukkah. So controversy, therefore, about what Hanukkah is really about is made even more complicated by the fact that the book of Maccabees mentions the Hasidim. Now, who were these Hasidim? They certainly weren't the guys from Williamsburg that we know today, because those Hasidim didn't appear until the 18th century. So there was this unknown group of people called the Hasidim, the pious ones, and we don't know who they are, who they were. And it is my theory that the Hasidim were mystics. And that's where mysticism comes in to this whole story. There's a famous theory by Gershon Scholem, the great German Israeli academic, who was the first person to study Kabbalah, mysticism, on a serious academic level. Of course, he is reported apocryphally to have said, mysticism is a load of rubbish, but the study of mysticism is a serious academic pursuit. And that is typical of the attitude of German academia. But his theory was this, that all religions, including Judaism, go through certain phases. And the phase they go through starts this way. The religion starts off with wonderful ideals. It tries to tell people who were worried about superstition and idols and the forces in the world over which they had no control and of which they were terrified, that there is a system, and this system enables you to cope with the pressures of life, but not by going to all these sub-gods and pseudo-gods and other gods, but essentially by accepting the one authority, the divine one, and in case of Judaism, the one you couldn't see. But then comes religion. It takes these nice ideals and gives it a structure. And the trouble is that the structure then removes people from a closeness to nature that they had, in which they understood the plants and the animals and the winds and the sun and the moon and everything like that, and channeled it into a structure in which God was there, but God was there as a kind of a system, not as a personal experience. And so after a period of time, he says roughly every 500 years, there's a kind of a revolution in which people want to go back to the earlier point where they felt so close to God because God was everywhere and around them. And that brings about what we call a mystical revolution. Now, people are always suspicious of mysticism nowadays. Even in Christianity, there's a famous phrase that mysticism starts in a mist and then ends in a schism. But the truth is that the aim of mysticism was to create a closer connection to God rather than the established religious formality. And it was very informal. And then you have the question of how was that idea of mysticism transmitted down through the ages? And when you look at the history of Judaism, you see that there was always a mystical tradition, but it coexisted in a kind of subworld with the main religious structure. So throughout the Torah, you see that fire is used as a symbol of this mystical relationship between the human being and God. First of all, you see it in the burning bush. Then you see it on Mount Sinai. And this idea of fire is something that runs beneath the surface. It goes on through the prophets. The prophets were the people who kept the tradition, the popular tradition of Judaism alive. Because if you look carefully at the Bible, you see that as far as the kings and the establishment was concerned, they did a terrible job. They were more pagan than the pagans. And of all the kings through Judea and Israel in that period, most of them were pagans. They worshipped other gods. And therefore you wonder, who kept the religion alive? And the answer is that the Bible refers to what he calls the B'nai Nevi'im, the sons of the prophets, these people who go around singing and dancing, happy clappy. And clearly that was the mystical tradition expressing itself as a subset of the religious establishment. The prophets carry on with this idea. They get into trouble with kings and priests all the time because they can't stand their corruption, but they keep the flame alive. And you have Elijah, for example, going up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And this chariot of fire, this Merkava, this chariot, is symbol of mysticism in his era. And by the time you get to the prophet Ezekiel, and the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, you have this amazing vision of God that is so non-rational and so crazy that Eric van Daniken thought it was proof that spaceships had come to Earth. And this was called the chariot, Merkava, after Elijah. And from that moment onwards, mysticism has a new name. It is called Merkava, the chariot that enables us to go up to heaven and bring God down to earth in a mystical way, not in an established way. Because in the established way, everybody's concerned with performance and ceremony and doing things in the temple and being good and behaving themselves in that structured way. The next we hear of this, there is a gap. The next we hear of this is by the time we get to the Talmud. Of course, we also hear of it now through the Dead Sea sects. But by the time we get to the Talmud, we have this talk about what is secret, nistar. We have this idea also of pardes. There is an orchard, a secret orchard. And there's this amazing story that most people are familiar with, that 4 rabbis entered into this special orchard, this pardes. And Rabbi Akiva said to them, when you come into this pardes, into this orchard, you're going to have a vision, an amazing vision. And don't be misled by this vision. Don't be distorted by it. If you see something that looks like water, don't confuse it with stone. And if you see something stone, don't confuse it with water. Well, they all went into this orchard. One of them went mad. The other one died. Elisha ben Abuya, the famous one, became apostate. He says, I can't bear this crazy mystical thing. I'd prefer to be with Greek rationalism, and he abandoned Judaism for Greek rationalism. So by the time you get to the Talmudic period, the Jewish world is split between those who are interested in fighting the Greco-Roman Empire, those who want to make peace, those who accept the rationalism of Greek philosophy, and those who say, no, rationalism is too logical, it's too dry, it's too much theoretical, we want to feel something, we want to be passionate. Rabbi Akiva represents that. Now, Rabbi Akiva had a pupil called Shimon bar Yochai, and Shimon bar Yochai was this amazing spiritual leader, and he couldn't bear anybody telling him what to do. And when the Romans under Hadrian said, stop this Jewish nonsense because it only leads to rebellion, because people like Bar Kokhba and others think they can fight us and defeat us, and they can't, Shimon bar Yochai had to go and hide in a cave with his son for 13 years. And when he came out, he looked around at everybody working normally, and he couldn't understand why they were not involved in mysticism. And he looked at them and burnt them. And God said to him, Shimon bar Yochai, you can't run the world your way. Not everybody can be a mystic. You better go back into the cave until you can calm down a little bit. And then he came out. But again, you see the connection of fire with mysticism. Now, that is, in a sense, all we know about mysticism in the Talmud itself. Shimon bar Yochai gave no other information. He was part of the religious structure. Most of what we know about him in the Talmud is legal, it's structural, it's not mystical. We now know that about that time, from the Dead Sea and other areas, the mystical revolution, being fed up with establishment, was looking at 2 different areas. One area was what's called the Heichal. Heichal is the hall, the palace. And that was a way of, how do we understand the palace of heaven? How do we find our way through the different rooms and the different stages in order to get through to God? And the other one was Shiur Koma, the measurement of the human. How can a human relate to something non-physical, God? How do we manage to bridge that gap? So we know that at that stage, this mystical area, known, as I said before, as the secret, nistar, the hidden, or alternatively, it was known under this idea of Merkava, was part of the tradition, but as the Talmud says, not everybody should get involved in it. You need guidance, you need advice. You can't just pick up a book and read it, or have somebody give you a little talk and think you know everything about it. But still, it's there. It's not that important. It doesn't play an important role. The important role of Kabbalah, as it comes to be called, owes itself to southern France, Provence, and northern Spain in the 13th century, where there was a rise of mysticism actually in Christianity too, amongst the Cathars and in southern France as well. And suddenly out of this area, you have a new way of looking at religious life. Spain, as you know, went through a period of great Jewish culture. And everybody at that particular moment thought that philosophy was the way to find the truth of God and the way to the religion. So whether it was Christianity, whether it was Islam, whether it was Judaism, they were all into Aristotle and Plato and the rational way of looking at life and looking at the world and looking at religion. And the Jewish community of Spain was swept up in this rationalism. And it produced this greatest of all philosophers, Maimonides, who is regarded as one of the most impressive philosophers in the non-Jewish world, who based himself on Aristotelianism with a little bit of Neoplatonism thrown into the mix to make it more accessible to religious life. But the same thing was true of Islam and Christianity. The world was dominated by this rationalism. And just as in Christianity, Eloise and Abelard rebelled against this rationality, so in Judaism, at this time, there was a rebellion against this rationality. And somewhere out of nowhere appears a book called the Zohar, attributed to, it was discovered or publicized by a man called Moses de Leon in Guadalquivir in northern Spain. And he claimed that this was a book that was written by Shimon Bar Yochai. But Shimon Bar Yochai lived 600 years earlier. And not only that, but this book was written in Aramaic that wasn't common in his day. And it was made up of a whole series of different lectures and commentaries. And there was an issue as to whether Moshe de Leon really found these documents and compiled them, or whether he actually wrote them. After he died, his wife swears she saw him write it all down. But this book suddenly, from nowhere, became the most important book of Jewish mysticism and the most important book in the canon of Jewish books after the Bible, the Talmud, and then you've got the Zohar. And the question is, how did such a book come to be so influential? Kabbalah, at that particular moment, was made up of three different strands. There was theoretical Kabbalah. Theoretical Kabbalah said, look, we don't want to be rational about this. We're not going to discover how the world was made. We're not going to discover so many things that we know nothing about. But we want to find a way of explaining how does God relate to us and how can we relate to God? So the first thing they came up with is the idea is this God is Ein Sof, has no end, is not physical in any way. Well, fine, if God's not physical in any way, how does God relate to us? And so they came up with an idea that had been begun a little earlier in Sefer Yetzirah, this idea of the Spheroid. The idea not of, sounds like the spheres, but they're not spheres. Sphera is a category, because in the Hebrew language, the word samach pei resh, safar, can mean to tell, sipur, a story. It can mean a book, a sefer. It can be a number, to count. It's all these things that encompasses all the different elements of human knowledge and communication. The Sphirot, and there are 10 of them, are 10 categories that include the mental, the emotional, physical, And they are what are called emanations, but basically they're like little transistors within us human beings, and transistors between us and God. And that's how God communicates with us, and we communicate with God. It's a kind of a filtration system. And these 10 Sphirot are the way that we need to meditate on God, experience God, and reach God in a personal experience that is not rational, and if anything is anti-rational. Rational is too theoretical. The other thing that they try to understand is, okay, well then, how was the world created? And they came up with this idea that the world was initially all God, completely divine. And then what God does is God shrinks a little bit of himself. The word that later Yitzchak Luria, Isaac Luria, and Safed said is called tzimtzum. He reduces himself, and into this vacuum, he creates some beautiful, beautiful kind of pure glass cycles and balls of creativity. But they were so beautiful. They couldn't survive when they were translated down to earth, and so they smashed. And this smashed glass, if you like, produced on the one hand sparks of spirituality, but also shards and broken things. And that explains why in this world there's bad as well as good. The bad comes from the shards, and the good comes from the sparks. And our job in life is to try to bring these two together, to harness, because there's something significant in the material as well as in the spiritual. Spiritual without material is not as good as material is incomplete without the spiritual. You need to bring them together. It is holistic. And so in effect, the Kabbalah returns to the original holistic Judaism that existed before Greek philosophy split between the rational and the non-rational, between the body and the mind. These were always combined and integrated in the biblical tradition and then in return to in the Kabbalistic tradition. And that remains the situation to this very day. There's a rational way of looking at things, and there's a mystical way of looking at things. But Kabbalah then had another side to it. It was, okay, so what practices do we go to? And mysticism practically gave us meditation, very similar to Indian meditation, probably cross-fertilized. It gave us exercises like yoga, very similar to yoga. And these practical exercises involved one in trying to connect with God. They also involved one in thinking about the letters and the numbers of the Hebrew writing, because the Torah was given in writing. And so to understand how God speaks and how God can talk to us, we need to look at the language and at the text. But then there was a third part. And the third part was, how do we deal with the ordinary person? And the ordinary person who can't read, who's not a philosopher, how do we deal with his or her problems? And the answer was what everybody else did in medieval times, a combination of astrology and magic and hocus pocus. And that area, if you like, the therapeutic side of Kabbalah, was the one that appealed to most people. In the 16th century, after the exile from Spain, many Jews moved to Safed, Tzfat in Israel. And under the leadership, first of all, of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, then under the leadership of Yitzchak Luria, Kabbalah changed Judaism. For example, there was no singing in the synagogue before that. They were still mourning the destruction of the temple. He brought in the idea of singing on Kabbalat Shabbat on a Friday evening. That all came to him. He said, let's go out into the fields and the hills and pray there. We don't want to be confined by a synagogue. This kind of popularization was what he was responsible for, taking something out of an esoteric area and making it popular. And then, of course, when Hasidism developed in the 18th century, they took on all of Luria's ideas and practices, the singing, the happy clappy, reaching out to the masses, not bothering about philosophy and the rational side. And that's where Western Europe, objecting to this craziness in Eastern Europe, fell back on the rationalism which the Enlightenment encouraged. Be rational, think about these things. And therefore this schism existed between the rationalism of the West, the mysticism of the East, made even worse by the 17th century false messiah Shabtai Tzvi, who convinced so many people that he was the Messiah and then turned to convert to Islam. And he based everything about him on the Kabbalah, on mysticism. So he gave mysticism a very, very bad name. I'm going through all this because I believe that to this very day, we need a mystical experience to reach God rather than a rational one. On the other hand, what passes for mysticism is the equivalent of saying, if you want to understand ancient literature, don't go to Shakespeare or Chaucer, just look at comic books. The popular side, the magic, the hocus pocus, may have some value, I would say, from, if you like, the placebo point of view, but nobody, I think, in their right mind could take it very seriously. And yet at this particular moment, that side has gripped the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox world. They have become focused beyond logic on the magical, non-rational side of Judaism, of that third wing. It's true, Hasidism encouraged people to study the Zohar, and every day, Hasidim, even children, study a little bit of the Zohar first thing in the morning. But it realized that most people are not academic and are not going to spend their time studying, and therefore they encouraged this reliance on a master, on a guru, on somebody else to do the heavy lifting for you, and you just have to turn up and ask for a blessing and everything will be fine. It's also, I have to say, this emphasis on this secondary mysticism, or tertiary mysticism as it should be called, has also been largely affected by the Holocaust. Because so many of the survivors of the Holocaust said, look what the rational world has done to us. Look, they allowed us to be destroyed and murdered and didn't lift a finger to help us and didn't save us beforehand, didn't care about us. Why should we rely on anything from the secular value system when they have shown themselves not to care about us? And so they've retreated from any rationalism, even though throughout Jewish history, rationalism has played an important part, and always great rabbis have spent time on the rational side as well as on the mystical side. So it is for this reason that I now come back to return to the idea of who were the Hasidim. And I believe that the Hasidim were those people at the time of Judah Maccabee who were the Kabbalists, who were treating the experience of Judaism alive, all the more so because they were in opposition to the Greek rationalists, to those who saw the distinction between the body, the athlete, and the mental, the spiritual, the soul rather, which was in the brain, and this idea of the ghost in the machine. So they stood for this spiritual, mystical tradition. And as this mystical tradition was always associated with fire and with light, that is why Hanukkah became so focused on the idea of light, regardless of whether there was a miracle or not, because light symbolized keeping the flame of the spirit alive. It represented this idea of uniting the physical with the spiritual in a holistic combination, which I think is what leads to a fulfilled Jewish life, which combines experience with theory. And so on that note, I come to a conclusion, and I'm looking forward to some interesting questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosen. It was very interesting and lots to ask you about that. I just want to put out there to all of our viewers, everybody who's with us, we're so glad you're here. This is for the remaining time we have together. We're opening it up to questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A, and we will ask them to Rabbi Rosen. I already have a couple of questions that have come to me for you, so I'm going to start right away. Here is the first question. This person asks, what contemporary Hanukkah traditions are most influenced by mysticism?
Well, that's a very good question. Most of the customs that we now have over Hanukkah are customs that have come from relatively modern times, like sufganiyot, and having these lovely fried, fattening foods because supposedly they are cooked in oil, and the oil reminds us of the temple. Then you have, of course, the dreidel, spinning the top, and gambling, because normally gambling is forbidden, but gambling is just allowed on Hanukkah because it reminds us of life is a lottery. You never know what's going to happen. You can get a good king one moment, a bad king the next moment, a good regime one moment, a bad regime the next moment. You know, that's very current at this particular moment. You have this constant changing and you never know how it's going to work out. And these are, if you like, secondary. Essentially, it's probably true that these customs and customs we have today, let's say of giving gifts and things like that, probably emerged during the Christian period. Because if Christianity was practicing having Christmas at this time, and Jews were having Hanukkah, and that raises another interesting point I forgot to mention, and that is that at the time of Hanukkah, in the Persian Empire, the Zoroastrian religion was a dominant religion, and that was a religion of fire, where fire was considered to be holy. And so I think all religions cross-fertilize each other. And I think many of the ceremonies we have of Hanukkah today have come cross-fertilization from Christmas and the non-Jewish world. But within the Jewish world, the big difference is the prayers. We have different prayers. We add on a little bit more. We make it more special. We thank God every day for the miracle of being alive. And that ritual side of it, to me, is more important than the actual candles. The candles are just, if you like, the hook we hang ideas on. And I think that's true of ritual in general. All ritual is designed, I think, to take you onto a higher level, but unfortunately most people stay with the ritual and don't go any further.
Thank you. We have another question here asking for you to expand a bit on the Pardes and the four rabbis going into the hidden meaning therein.
Okay, well, that's very good. This comes in the Talmud, and the Talmud starts off in Chagiga, this volume, about saying, you know, look, there are certain things up above, certain things below, certain things behind that you don't need to bother with. After all, the Bible, the Torah itself, is very practical. There's no theology in the Torah itself. There's a simple statement that God is there. The first of the 10 Commandments don't say you have to believe in God. It just says God is there. You relate to him in any way you possibly can. And so the Torah is mainly concerned with coping with life. That's why it doesn't mention directly anything about life after death. So the rabbis of the Talmud were very conscious of the fact that the role of the rabbi and of the Talmud was to teach you how to live. And that's why they said, don't spend too much time thinking about abstract ideas, just think about how to cope. And it's in that context, that the Talmud goes on to talk about this entering the orchard. Now, before that, the earliest reference we have of an orchard is the statement in Avot that says, this world is like an orchard in front of the palace. The palace is like life after death, when you're not bothered about physical ailments or anything physical at all. And before that, you have this garden. Now, some religions will say, don't bother with life. It's a vale of tears. It's a ghastly place. It's only the afterlife that counts. They counteracted it by saying, no, life matters now. Make the most of it. If you don't cultivate your garden properly, if you don't look after yourself, both physically and spiritually, why would you get into the next world? What would be the point of it? It only exists as an abstract theoretical place that most people don't get to. So focus on the world now. So in that context, Pardes is another way of saying life now. But then how do we deal with life now? On the one hand, at the time, the Stoics of Greek philosophy would say, don't bother life. Life is terrible. It's not worth anything. Go and sit in a barrel. Deny yourself. Don't enjoy anything. That's pointless. On the other hand, you had the people who enjoyed life, those people who really wanted to have fun all the time. And they were saying, look, we agree that this life isn't very important, it's too physical, but since we're here, we might as well enjoy it. So have fun, have the Epicureans, have a good time. And Judaism came in the middle and says, no, don't go to either extreme. Try and have a balance in the middle and try and combine both. And therefore, the idea of the Pardes became, how do I live my life? And 4 rabbis going into this Pardes, each one represented a different way of looking at life. You had Rabbi Akiva himself, who was very practical, very spiritual, but also was very militaristic. He believed in fighting the Romans. As against that, you had Ben Azai. Ben Azai was the eternal scholar who spent the whole of his life in books, so much so that he didn't want to get married. He was against sex, so to speak, but not against sex, but scholarship was all he wanted. He wanted to retreat into the monastery, so to speak. Then you had Ben Zoma, who was very, very excitable. And he thought that what we have to do in religion is to just excite using possibly what we would call drugs or alcohol to stimulate one's religious experience. And he went mad. And then you had the arch-rationalist, who was this wonderful man called Elisha ben Abuya, who said, I'm sorry, I just can't deal with all this. I'm a rationalist. I want to do what's rational. And he abandoned Judaism. And in a sense, you have this kind of microcosm of Jewish life, Jewish religious life. Some people want to take it into the political realm. Some people want to take it into the scholarly and the academic realm. Some people want to take it into a hedonistic realm. And some people want to take it into an abstract realm. And what the Torah is saying, what this message is saying is, look, there are many different ways, and they are all important in their own way. But don't be deluded into thinking there's only one way. And don't shut your mind off just because you have one point of view to all the others. And in a sense, what he's saying is the element that's most important in religion in a spiritual sense is to keep an open mind. Because no human being is the same. What works for one isn't going to work for another. And that's what Kabbalah or the mystic world is trying to tell you. Don't be frightened to experiment. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least give things a try.
Thank you. Here's another question, which is, Shalom argues that every mystical tradition is specific to the religion it rebels against. So what are the differences between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mysticism that you can tell us about?
Well, that's very interesting because at the time of the rise of mysticism, you had, for example, in Christianity, Pico della Mirandola was an absolutely brilliant, wonderful man, and Reuchlin, who again was a wonderful religious leader, both of whom defended Judaism, and both of whom thought that Kabbalah actually verified Christianity, because they said, if we think God has three parts to the Trinity, those would be what Kabbalah calls the emanations, the Spheroid. We only have three, but you have 10. And so these intermediaries, so to speak, were used by Christianity also to take a non-rational way of proving the validity of Christianity. In Islam, you had the rise of Sufism. And again, Sufism, as you know, believes in dancing and ecstasy and doing all these things that the Hasidim do and that other people do. So you can see in all three areas, they exist in the same way. For example, you had the Goliaths, and you had those of you who know Orff's Carmina Burana will know about these ecstatic monks and nuns having a whale of a time in the Middle Ages. So all these things can be found in Christianity and in Islam too. And the truth of the matter is, all religion is very similar. All in theory believe in the same things. They're just ways of doing it, just some traditions of doing things. But in essence, there's a common core.
One of our, one person is asking, don't we have too much irrational mysticism alive in America today already?
Irrational.
That's...
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, no, astrology, let's take, forget about Judaism. Astrology, millions and millions of people turn to astrology. I don't get it. Doesn't make any sense to me. You go down the street in New York and you have palm readers and people with crystal balls all over the place in this day and age. Can you believe it? And yet, what I come to the conclusion is, therefore, the scientific rational world is failing. It's not working. And I think that's probably true. Just as the ideal of Marxism didn't work in practice, so many of the things that are rational are good, but they don't speak to our souls. And so there are many people who, of different religions, and even academics, who say there seems to be a kind of a religious gene, a kind of part of us that needs something spiritual. But very often, if you make the wrong contact with the wrong person, that will be channeled into something which is too superstitious. And, in my lovely Persian community, where most of them come from an Oriental background, where Kabbalah and the rabbis who control Kabbalah played a very, very important role, I love them to pieces, but they're superstitious as anything. And however I say to them, don't bother with the evil eye, don't bother with curses and blessings, send them all to me, I'll take them with pleasure. Oh no, they wouldn't dream of it. So, that's human nature, can't help it.
Do you see I'm just to tag onto that, do you see a parallel between the kind of irrational reliance on astrology or anything like some of the things that you've been talking about, crystal ball, palm reading, and this particular current time period that we're in, as compared to what you were talking about in other time periods? The one that you brought up was, post-Nazi Germany and people rejecting, rationalism. We can look back at the time of Judah Halevi as well, and a similar thing happening. I'm just curious if you think there's something about this time period we're in that leads people away from the kind of religious observance that we may have seen in the past.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Let's take Victorian England. Victorian England was a time when people like Huxley, Darwin were transforming the way we think about life in a rational way. It was the most superstitious period in a very long time. You had people believing in fairies, just think of plenty of examples, but I just give one important one. There was a special group of people who were so involved in the supernatural. There was a woman called Madame Blavatsky who thought she could speak to the dead, and she became the most popular mind reader in London at the time. There were people believed even even there was a British Israel Society that believed that Britain came from the 10 lost tribes, because the Hebrew word for Britannia is made up of two words: Brit, covenant, Ania, a boat, the covenant of boats. British is made out of Brit, the covenant in Hebrew, and Ish of a man. And they came and they lived in England. Superstition rose as a reaction to too much rationalism. So I think this has always been a problem, but it's gone in cycles. And we're in a cycle at the moment, and Lord knows what's going to happen. I've got various chats on my screen. Does that mean, and questions and answers, you're looking at those too, I assume?
We're looking at those, yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we're pulling from those. Here's one. Here's the next one from those, which is asking about Mao's Sur, and asking if that might have been composed from a mystical perspective, especially thinking about the last verse.
Well, this is very interesting, because Mao's Sur is a poem that emerged in the medieval times. It was not known before. And what's interesting about Mao's Sur, if you look at the words carefully, you see Hanukkah is a kind of a postscript. You start about God saving us from all this kind of problems. You talk about God saving us from the Babylonians, Bavel. You talk about saving us from the Greeks and the Romans, put on a sort of a subplot at the end. And many people think that that was meant to be Christianity, because what happened was that during the period of medieval times, Jews were not allowed to say anything negative about Christianity. They would end up being expelled or burnt at the stake or whatever it is. So they used various codes to describe the pain they were in, the crusades that were killing them. Everybody was beating them up and giving them a tough time. So first of all, they used code of Edom, Esau. Edom was red to represent the Romans. And then Edom came to be the code for Christianity. And so when they talked about the Greeks, they were really not referring to the ancient Greeks, they were referring to the Greek religion of Christianity, which they saw as being more Greek than Jewish in any sense. And so it's, if you like, a combination, a poetic combination of a reference to all the different oppressors in different generations, all rolled into one poem. So it's an example of medieval poetry, and it could have been written by a mystic. Much of the medieval poetry we have, Yehuda Halevi and Ibn Gabirol, they're all mystics, but I don't know for certain, because we don't know for certain who this guy was. He remains anonymous. And in fact, you know, the name Mordechai, which is the acrostic, goes back to Esther and Haman. It's got nothing to do with Hanukkah or Purim, Hanukkah rather.
We have another Hanukkah-related question here. How significant was Hanukkah in Jewish life prior to the late 19th century American efforts to reportedly help Jewish children who were feeling insignificant compared to their non-Jewish Christmas celebrating friends?
It was always very important, because even at the Talmudic times, they said that Purim and Hanukkah, two festivals that were not mentioned in the Bible, had almost the same status as biblical festivals, which is why when we make the blessings, both for Hanukkah and for Purim, we say, "Blessed are you, God, who has given us your commandments and commanded us to light the Hanukkah lights." And they say, well, where did God command it? Oh, well, God commanded it when in the Torah he said, I'm giving you the right to interpret the law. And that gave them the power. So it was always important with extra prayers and everything like that. And particularly, I think, anything that puts the focus on religion in the home, whether it was the Purim meal, Hanukkah in the home, became very important, because originally all the festivals primarily were celebrated at the sanctuary, whether it was a tabernacle or the temple. And these were festivals that were home-based. So I think they were always very, very important. I think what America brought was the Hanukkah bush, if you like, and the idea of presents. But the festival as such were always very, very important. A lot of legal and midrashic and explanations and commentaries about them.
Okay, I know we're almost out of time, but to wrap up, and I think we've covered all of our questions. So to wrap up, I'd ask you if there was something that you wanted to leave us with. Leave all of us who, some of us who've studied mysticism and Kabbalah before, and some of us who've never even heard of it before. What is one gift that Jewish mysticism has given to us that you would like to then give to us again today through your words, that we can leave with on this time of Hanukkah night?
I would say the most important thing that mysticism message for me is that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how much you know. It doesn't matter what your past is. Doesn't matter what. What matters is you at this moment, and what are you experiencing? What are you feeling? And have your feelings got some spiritual dimension? And how you express it, whether it's mentally, whether it's through exercise, whether it's through meditation, it's up to you. But in the end, all God asks of you, to quote the prophets, is that you be a good person, and you find a way to be a good person. And you know, all this division and dissension that we have, and that Hanukkah shows us has always been there. I wish it were not there. And I wish somehow or other this could bring us together. But like superstition and human nature, we're not going to change.
Rabbi Rosen, thank you so very much for being with us here tonight, and for your inspirational talk, which has kindled within us the inspiration to seek out our own spiritual journey and our own lighting of our spirits during this time of Hanukkah and beyond. We thank you so much. It was so interesting, so enlightening. Thank you for being with us. And I'd also once again like to thank the Schwartzes. Thank you so much, Joe and Marilyn, for your generosity in establishing and endowing this lecture in loving memory of your parents. I was remiss not to mention your mothers before, but of course, all of your parents, Jack and Rose Schwartz, and Samuel K. and Elizabeth L. Goldstein, their memories are for blessing always. And thank you for sharing this amazing opportunity with us in their honor. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us, and happy Hanukkah.